Now we come to part of the pattern where we have to work the sleeve, and for that we need to pick up stitches on the underarm. We need to start in the centre of that underarm. Now I've gone ahead and slipped all of my held stitches onto my needle, but I've kept my waste yarn in there. I like to keep the waste yarn in there. It's just for insurance purposes, just to make sure that everything's correct and I've picked everything up. Just in case if I have to rip back, then I just rip back to this waste yarn or cable, and I don't have to worry about picking up stitches. Oh, excuse me. Excuse me. Okay, and then so once you've done that, just slip your needle through all of those stitches, or pop your needle points on if you've used a spare cable to hold those. That makes it even easier. So then you find the center of your underarm. Now I have to pick up 5 stitches, work around, and then 5 stitches, so that's 10. So I should have 10 stitches here to pick up from, and to find the middle I start over here with my first picked up first cast on stitch. When I cast on these stitches and worked the body, these are the cast on stitches here on this ridge. So I find the first one and count in. So I find the first V, little V underneath the cast on. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my first stitch to pick up should be the 6th one here. And then, so that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I go around knitting from the stitches on the needle. So I poke the point of my needle in just under the cast on edge into that V of that stitch. I'm going to leave quite a nice tail just in case I have to neaten off any of these stitches afterwards. I can use that yarn. So yarn goes over the tip of the needle and through that V to pick up a stitch. It's very similar to a crochet move. So then under that cast on ridge and into the next V, I'm just going to flip my tail end of yarn over my working yarn just to lock it in a bit better, and then pull that loop through. So that's 2, and then the next V is right here. 3, 4, 5. Now this leaves me with quite a gap before my first stitch from the waste yarn here. Quite a gap there. Now when I knit this next stitch, it is going to bring it together, but if you'd prefer, you can pick up another stitch here, and then on the next round you can knit that stitch and this stitch together, or this stitch and this stitch together, just to close up that gap a little more. But I'm just going to carry on and knit from these held stitches, and if I do then need to close up that gap afterwards, I have this tail end of yarn which I can then weave through this gap and then weave back again if need be. So I've picked up those 5 stitches oh, excuse me, and then I'm going to knit all of these stitches that were being held while I worked the body, and as you can see that's closed up that gap actually quite nicely. Sometimes the gap is quite large and you may need to thread some yarn through, just sort of following where the stitches naturally form, and then that can close up that gap a little if you like. I do that with socks as well. Sometimes if you need just to close up that gap a little, you can just use a bit of spare yarn, thread it onto a darning needle or tapestry needle, and then weave in the ends nice and neatly on the inside, and helps close up that gap and you really can't see it. So I'm just knitting around these stitches that were held, and I'm leaving my waste yarn in there just until I know for sure that I haven't made any mistakes, that I've got all of the stitches that I need, that my sleeve has the right number of stitches. And this will give you, you won't see where this sleeve join is, unless of course you leave your waste yarn in when you're wearing it. But yeah, you won't see where those stitches were picked up from the waste yarn. It's a natural flow of the knitting. It'll look completely seamless, which of course it is. Make sure I'm not catching in any of that waste yarn as I knit. It'll make it harder to remove later. But I've used a yarn that's slightly fluffy, which I advise against when choosing a waste yarn to hold stitches. I would very much recommend a nice smooth slick yarn, maybe a nylon or a rayon or even bamboo or silk, something quite slick that's not going to catch on these stitches. So there's my last stitch knitted. Bring those around the cable a little more. So I'm just going to pop the ends of my waste yarn inside so it's out of the way. I'm going to bring this around so it's going to be easier for me to pick up those last few stitches. There's my long tail, I'll poke him in there as well. And so I'm going to have a bit of a gap again between this last stitch and the first stitch that I'm going to pick up, but that should close up naturally. So here's the first stitch, underneath that ridge and into the center of that V we go. Get the yarn, make sure it's nice and close together with that last stitch so it doesn't make that gap any bigger. So 1 is the next V, 2, 3, 4, oopsie, caught a little bit of extra yarn there, 4, and the last one 5. I'm going to pull that through. So that gap actually looks quite a bit bigger on this side than that side, so I may have to go in with a bit of spare yarn and loop around, following where these stitches flow, and then weave in the ends on the underarm just to close in that gap a little more. Or of course you could pick up a stitch there and then on the next round knit it together with either this stitch or this stitch, and that will help close that gap as well. But I'm just going to carry on because I can fix that later. So then of course you would need to add a stitch marker for the beginning of your round, and then the first 7 rounds are just knit. So go ahead and knit. Now I haven't added a stitch marker, so I'm not going to do too many because I want to go back and put a stitch marker on there so I know I've got the right place. Okay, so that's how you pick up the stitches for your underarm.